Trying to get started. Hi, everyone. All right. So I'm just going to stop this bit here. Oh, bless you, Demi. Welcome to our first live academy chat. This is really exciting for us. It's something we've wanted to do for a while. We've had lots of barriers ourselves to doing so, but really excited to now be able to have our first chat. The reason we've chosen this topic, barriers to client progress, is for a number of reasons. It's generally one of the main things we're talking about in the academy community, but also over in how much we do talk around behavior change in our academy as well. And so thought we'd jump on, have a chat, open it up for some questions, discussions. I've got half hour, power hour, and if anyone's met me before, you'll know that I'll fill half hour quite easily. So I'm going to make sure that I am fast and sharp to be able to then allow lots of times for questions. We've already got some really solid questions through already, so there's some really cool chats that we'll be able to have over this time. Now, if I'm looking two places, that's because I am also live on Instagram as well. And so I've got two screens happening. So apologies if my eyes are darting a little bit. I'm going to try and minimize that a little bit. So I'm just going to change my view. There we go. Just to make sure. Oh, there we go. You can all see me properly and I can see you. All right. So when we're talking barriers, I think the biggest thing is we are often in a place where we're either rushed for time or we feel like we are very good fixers. And so considering barriers or resistors to change can actually be really vulnerable as a practitioner. It can also be time consuming, but I am also here to tell you it's one of the most worthwhile things that you will do as a practitioner if you can seek to understand and listen to someone's barriers to change and with curiosity and also safety in that conversation as well. However, that can take time, and there's also ways in which you can do so. So, what we wanted to go through today is really just to introduce how you might be able to think about different barriers in someone's life that you might be working with or for yourself in a really safe space, but also one that considers all the diverse aspects of what may actually be contributing to someone's barriers to change. And when we're talking about those barriers, basically what we're talking about are obstacles that someone might be going through which prevents decision making just as much as it prevents action or progress in terms of the habits and daily behaviors. So making sure that we don't just think about the physical barriers, but also all the barriers to change that may exist in someone's life. The really beautiful thing about considering barriers, not in the negative sense, but in the positive sense, is that it enables a really great conversation from the start, but also a productive one that meets that client where they're at in that moment. So one thing that really resonates with me in the way of going through barriers is to break it into different sections. Now, not everyone's brain is going to work the same, and not everyone's going to have the same way of thinking. So take with this what you will, and really use it to come up with your own little strategy on what barriers work for you and how that discussion unfolds and what areas you like to place them in. We'll go through what barriers are and which ones to consider today. But then also we will introduce you to the academy where we've actually got a module on this very subject, which then works more in depth in terms of how you actually help to overcome those barriers and more intricacies and also like, I guess, practical tools that you can use as well. So appreciating the time of everyone in this circumstance. So the first one I wanted to kind of introduce you to is this concept of the wheel of well-being. Now, I stumbled upon this a while ago one version of this a while ago when I was doing a different project. And I was looking at all these different little wheels of someone's well-being and realizing that they also work as barriers. So just as much as they might be enablers to change, a lot of these things that we're talking about, at the same time, they can be the barriers to change as well. And so opening that conversation of going, if we're going to explore barriers, at the same time, we're actually exploring enablers at the same time as well. So one of the first segments of someone's well-being, or that in that wheel of well-being, is financial. And so if we're considering someone's barrier to change in terms of the financial sense, you might be exploring the financial barriers in terms of someone's affordability around food, and all aspects of financial security, but also financial stress. And one thing that we need to consider is our own barriers as practitioners is we often, not always, come from a very white privileged background, where sometimes we are in fixed mode in terms of what would work in our lifestyle or our environment, and not necessarily considering where that person's at financially or in terms of their not capability, sorry, capacity financially of what they can actually physically change based around their financial situation. And so considering someone's financial situation and food security is a really core part and one of the first things you should be doing alongside getting to know that client. It should be just a critical part that you're having in the conversation in a really safe, secure way with that person to build rapport and trust, and also ensure that everything you're doing together, considering that individual. Another component of barriers that you need to think about is the social side. And some of it is in our control and some isn't. Same with financial. So when we're thinking social and social barriers, and what I mean by that is around the peer group someone might be in, the social aspect of what they're encompassing in their day to day, and remembering that social isn't just that one-to-one person interaction in person. It also is the social media that they're devouring, what their messages they're hearing, what pressure they're feeling from the environment they're in socially. So there's lots of aspects there that I think don't get as much consideration, but definitely worthwhile in considering when we're talking to someone, because we can actually then, if we understand that social is one of the biggest barriers to change or the biggest pressures resisting change, it can actually be then part of what we do or part of the conversation on how to navigate that, whether it is lots of social occasions, whether it is the family pressure or the culture in the family around that social occasion, whatever it may be, that needs to be a part of what we talk about. Another barrier to consider is emotional. And emotional definitely crosses over a little bit into mental health and all those things that we'll cover in a sec. But when we're talking emotional barriers, we do tend to think about and being trauma informed, first of all, as practitioners, but also considering the trauma history of that individual, the emotional response, the different feelings, emotions they might be going through at one point in time, but also their emotional connection to food and body is also really valid here. So it does cover a little bit around relationship with food, relationship with body, but a lot of that does belong in mental. And to some extent, it doesn't really matter where it belongs. It just is one of those things in terms of our emotions being something that can be a barrier to our decision-making skills or our ability to progress through behavior change strategies or actions. So that's probably the biggest thing there in terms of considering where someone's emotional load is at, because it also heavily impacts their emotional capacity to create change or be part of change. Now, cultural, this is something I talk a lot about, particularly in sport, but everywhere. The culture that we are in or the culture we are a part of will heavily impact our ability to create change and progress. A lot of culture is actually out of our control, but a lot of it is in our control in the wider sense. So I think as practitioners, we have a role for advocacy, and sometimes our role is actually influencing culture to help a client or a group change and progress through behavior. Whereas other times it's actually listening to that culture in a sense of respect. For example, hearing what culture they are from and what food rules, beliefs, and all those types of things are a part of that, to then be able to shift our way of working with that person to fit into their culture, their religion, their beliefs. A really important part to consider here is also food beliefs. As we see a shift in religion, we also see a shift toward food being part or kind of a religion, and it's got really strong beliefs there. So you may find that in terms of cultural barriers to change, food beliefs is a part of that. And navigating food beliefs and building rapport enough to be able to challenge food beliefs is a really critical part as your role as a nutrition provision professional. So when we're then considering the next one, it's physical. So physical barriers are probably the ones we spend most time considering, because physical is obvious. Physical is kind of in our face as practitioners, but also in conversation. It might be physical barriers in terms of physical disability alongside physical skill limitations, and then also things like chronic illness and physical signs of appetite, hunger, those types of things. So all of those things can absolutely impact our ability to make decisions around food or food behavior, but it's not the only thing as we're going through with all these different barriers to change and whatnot. The other component to consider is environmental. And environmental is a tricky one because I think there's two parts to environmental barriers to change or components and enablers to change. Environment's one of the biggest things that will be able to enable a habit or action, but it's also one of the things that can actually pull it down and make it very, very hard. As practitioners, we've got to really appreciate that we aren't there all the time for our clients. However, one key part is absolutely designing an environment or helping them design an environment where the decision or the action that you're trying to enable feels easy, obvious, and enjoyable for that individual. And environment's just such a key part of that, that I feel like is such an important part of who we are as practitioners and the role that we play and the impact and the value that we have as well. So environment can include anything from access, food access, shop access, in the positive sense and also the negative sense, but also can include things like the ease of access and those types of things. Um, we have to also consider their like convenience decisions, the environment, the workplace someone is in, and this overlaps a little bit with culture as well. And all those things are things that we can consider. The reason I said there was two parts to it is because environmental could also include things like sustainability decisions and those types of things about food. So there are kind of two parts that you can think of environment as. Sometimes we lean towards environment being the environment we're in right now, whether it's that home or workplace or whatever it may be. But we can also consider the bigger picture of the environment based around sustainability, environmental concerns with food decision. The other thing I wanted to cover, probably the thing I spend most time on, the really big connection between food decision and mental well-being. So there is a very close connection between those two, and it's inextricable. Like you just can't separate the two. And when we're talking the mental barriers to decision making around food, but also behavior change, I think obviously we get disordered eating and eating disorder within this. Our relationship with food is key to consider. It should be a critical part of the conversation from the get-go, no matter who you're working with, alongside relationship with body. It can also be making sure that we hold in the conversation the mental health of that person, because it is such a critical part of then being able to navigate their capacity for change in that moment, in that month, in that year, and being able to then scale and change that depending. So I'm talking the appreciation of someone's mental health, whether that be depression, anxiety, and how that's impacting their ability to make decisions or create food opportunity, because their capacity could be completely depleted and they may be in that crisis mode where change just feels, even in the smaller sense, completely overwhelming. The other component and the last bit in that wheel of well-being that we always want to consider is that intellectual part of decision making and barriers. So some of that will be making sure that from the get-go we're appreciating who we're talking to, their education background, their ability to understand the information we're giving them, and being able to scale that information back and forth depending on where they come from, what their history is with food knowledge, information, that kind of thing. But also their curiosity to food and nutrition as well is really important here. It is completely okay for us to be obsessed with food, but we shouldn't expect our clients to be obsessed to the same level that we are in food and nutrition and how important it is. So making sure that we're meeting it at the right place and giving full permission not to be obsessed with food is absolutely okay. The other piece there, something that I feel like does not get discussed enough, and I think is an area of upskilling that we should all be a part of, is the consideration of neurodiversity within our client group. So intellectual piece of barriers is making sure that we understand that person in terms of how they can make change and what's preventing them from making changes, so that we can adapt and change our recommendations to meet that person. For example, ADHD, autism will impact a person's ability to create change or stick to change, or even be able to hold the ability to focus on one behavior at one time. And there's strategies that we can use as practitioners to help them achieve that and empower them to set themselves up in their home, in their workplace, to create behavior that doesn't feel like it's too much for them or beyond what they're doing. And I had a client come to me. She was an elite athlete, and she came up to me after a session. She's like, Alicia, I've been to a dietitian before, but I need to tell you something. I was like, oh, go for it. Like, tell me. Because I love this feedback, because I think we can all learn from each other. And she's like, I have both ADHD and autism, and I didn't feel like they knew how to work with me. And I felt like everything they were telling me made sense, but I had no ability to actually put it into practice with how I'm challenged every day to even remember how to eat. So I think that's really important, that sometimes we overcomplicate things or over systemize things, but then also we forget sometimes it's the smallest things that can make the biggest difference in someone's life. And when we're considering barriers to change, I think sometimes we want to fix everything all at once. And we give people so many tools and so much information that they feel overwhelmed. And you might think that that's what they want, but at the same time, they don't even know where to start. So, yeah, I just wanted to go through all those different ways of thinking about barriers and open it up to questions and see where the conversation goes. And I'm really stoked. I really wanted to talk for 15 minutes. I've talked for 15 minutes to allow lots of time for chats and stuff, because there's a big why towards barriers. And that's, you're going to improve engagement. We know rapport is such a key part of how we work with our clients. Without rapport, we don't get that longevity in relationship. We don't get that buy-in. So if we are nailing our ability to understand and appreciate, and first of all, listen to someone's barriers to change, you'll set yourself up for so much more success with their individual progress. So yeah, hopefully you found that really beneficial, and we'll open up to questions now. Instagram, feel free to type, and same with Zoom. If you wanted to jump on cameras, mic, whatever you may feel. I do have some questions already that we got through Instagram, but I'll let the crowd who are here ask first.
I can ask a question to start, if that's all right.
That.
I'm curious to know, how do you include this as part of your assessment along with all the other things that we're asking about when we first meet with someone?
100%. And I think that is the biggest issue, is we either go into a session going, I have really limited time with this individual. Either you don't even know if they're going to attend a review, but also you've only got a set amount of time to meet them, chat to them, and still give them value enough to come back. And so with so much listening, I think there's a lot of doubt in ourselves as well, of like, well, if I do so much listening in the first session, what are they even going to go away with? And so I think it's about understanding and appreciating, what do I actually need to know first? I know with our clients and how we work with our clients at compl'eat, one thing that I realized in this whole business is that I think sometimes we go at it with a real clinical lens first, because we feel like that's the most important thing we need to know, but forget that there's so much underneath that human that is leading to that clinical piece that we forget in our rush for information in what we know, or the science behind nutrition. So we've flipped that in the way that we onboard our clients to focus so much more on understanding the person that's coming through our doors. We work online and through a membership system rather than an online clinic system, for this very reason, that we just felt so limited with the individual's, I guess, experience, because barriers don't happen when you're in that session with someone. They happen when they're in the home or in the workplace or the training environment, whatever it may be. And so by being there when they need us as these things happen, we just found we're able to flow a whole lot more. So to answer your question, I think it wouldn't be about trying to know everything from that first piece of meeting someone, but maybe working through, well, what do I actually need to know in the clinical sense when I first meet someone? And how can I maybe pull that back a little bit to allow some time to talk about who they are, what's worked in the past, what hasn't, what's getting in the way of them achieving success right now, so that you have a better understanding of not just what's in their way, but also their readiness to change and whatnot as well. So it does take a little bit of a shift back. It can be really vulnerable to work through. Do I question more about, am I getting too much information in some areas that maybe I could gather later, to be able to allow myself some more conversation earlier? So that's definitely the shift we've made. And I have not regretted it. It's been absolutely incredible to really superpower that first few conversations, because we have so much more knowledge about who they are, why they're there, but also how we meet them where they're at right now in terms of capacity, readiness, relationship with food, all the things. So yeah, absolutely worth trialing what works for you, but highly recommend.
Thank you.
All right. Anyone else got a question? It's really fun in here. Debbie appreciates that. All right, I'm gonna, just to avoid too much silent time, I'm going to read out a question that I had come through. What about when you feel you get to the point when the barriers feel too much? So you get to a point where you're like, there are just too many barriers and we're not making any progress. And I think that's such a good question, because I am sure everyone can vibe with that. I read that question, I'm like, oh my God, that's definitely me to a T at times. And this is where both parties are probably really frustrated. Either you've got a client that feels like everything's too much and is not making any progress and is probably very mean to themselves in their head about this, because sometimes a self-blame approach is very much what diet culture in particular has set ourselves up for. But then you've also got on the other side a dietitian who's like, oh my God, I'm giving them everything and they're not, complying. And so there's a mismatch often in that conversation. I think whenever we get to this point, it's about considering, first of all, some self-reflection and absolutely doing some supervision if this is something you really vibe with, to be able to work through individually or as a group supervision side of things. Because there's a point here that either the client is in a different stage of change than you've kind of gone towards. So if really old school, going through like that pre-contemplation all the way through to action and those types of things, there's a chance that that person is honestly just not even near the stage of change you need them to be at to create the change you're looking to create. And taking a step back, and if you do feel like they're in that pre-contemplation phase of nowhere near readiness, it is more about taking a step back and going, you know what, success here is actually curiosity. It's awareness, it's safety, it's rapport building, and taking pressure completely away from action and towards just, you know what, we're just going to take some time to appreciate what's going on, reflect, get to know each other, build trust, and then move them through at a pace that hopefully you have capacity to do to be ready for change. The other point to this is that there's a chance that the things that you're working towards or the actions that you've put in towards this person actually aren't matching what their version of success is or what they feel like they need to prioritize on. So we talk a lot in the academy about meeting a person where they're at, probably to the point where I'm like, we probably say it too much. However, what do we mean by that is that the things that you're looking to achieve, the things that you're looking to progress on, are they actually what you want, or are they what the client wants? Because we don't want a situation where you're the expert sitting above that person. We want it to a point where you're sitting right next to that person. They are the expert in their life and you are the expert in nutrition, but there's not one better than the other. You're working towards a common goal. So if you are not getting any buy-in, if you're not getting any progress, I really urge you to stop thinking about that as a lack of compliance or willpower or whatever it may be, and actually offer it as an opportunity for a better conversation. And it may be showing your own vulnerability to that person, because vulnerability breeds vulnerability, right? So if you say to that person, I'm actually really unsure what our next step is or what we're able to do here. I'm feeling like we're not making the progress that we're hoping for. How are you feeling? Or like, where do you feel like we should focus instead? Or, what's coming in the way? So it's an opportunity for a bigger conversation or a more in-depth conversation, and shows vulnerability on both sides. It's also an opportunity to reflect in yourself. Maybe I have gone too hard here. And are the things that I've recommended or we've worked towards actually in their wheelhouse of capacity right now, or ability based around the barriers we talked about at the start of this session? And being okay to scale that right back to a point where you're getting them to say, okay, well, this isn't working. What if we did this instead? How many out of 10 confidence are you that that would be possible in terms of ease and, being really obvious in their life and enjoyable in their life? And if they're answering an 8+, you're getting closer. If they're answering a 7's such a nothing number, they are not confident. It's got to be 8, 9, 10 confidence. So making sure that they're part of that decision and making sure that they're feeling confident is just as important as you going, you know what, this is what you need to fix your life, go do it. So we need to make sure we're taking that time. So that question is, it was really, really powerful. I've got more questions, but I'm going to just put it to the floor. Does anyone have any comments or questions about what we just went through? So the next question is, how is the best way to find out about these barriers? So I think we've had that question actually at the start, which is really powerful. and a bit of a repeat. The only thing I'd probably add to that is making sure we don't try and do it all at once, and being curious and reflective and open in our conversation will allow these barriers to come out over time. You don't need to know everything about that person from the moment you have that first conversation. It's really repetitive reflections. It's always checking in. It's making sure that the first step to barriers is actually awareness. We can't fix something we're not aware of. So they may not have all the answers coming to you. They definitely won't. And they won't even be aware of all the barriers that are coming in their way. But by being curious and open-ended and building rapport, you'll be able to get to that point of appreciating and understanding that person so much more. In our academy module around this very thing, around barriers, we'd go through in more detail all these areas about how to find out about barriers, but also then how to actually enable that behavior beyond here. But with the time we have today, I definitely was respecting that. And I'm glad I did, because it's approaching that time already. And the next question we had, I'm just reading it out, sorry. If a client is mentally unwell with little capacity to change, what should we do at that point? I think this is such a beautiful question, Megan, and one that I wish I had sooner as a practitioner, because I don't think my awareness or even on my radar was mental health. A lot of the time when I think through my initial experience as a dietitian, I went in looking at the, I guess, the symptom and wanting to fix the symptom, which, maybe sometimes is weight, and that's why they're referred. And so you just fix and wait. You're like, oh, this is fine. But weight, for example, doesn't happen in a vacuum. Behaviors don't happen in a vacuum. There's so many things that go underlying this. So when we're considering someone's mental health, and say they're in a state of, let's say, depression and anxiety for this example, we know that that state is going to be really hard for many to even have the ability or capacity to make dinner, even shop for food. And so sometimes what we're aiming to do is actually just keep scaling and keep giving permission to ease their load. And so your role as the dietitian can actually be an enabler and a whole lot of kindness and compassion in that moment, rather than adding stress or adding pressure to improve or process. So what we often do in that moment is actually get to a point where we're finding what solution fits well for them, and being completely okay with the best option in that moment being super convenient, super processed, but hey, celebrating the win that they ate, for example, or celebrating their win that they got up off the couch and they got something out of the cupboard and they ate. And it can be that basic, and you can be their absolute cheerleader in that basic option, because action creates action. And if you get to a point where you're giving them too much to do or overcomplicating what they need to do, then they'll end up absolutely either being really unkind to themselves and not showing much compassion because they've failed again, or they'll get into that freeze point where they either disconnect completely and stop talking to you, because what's the point, Megan? I'm not going to be able to do anything she tells me to do anyway. Or they'll find someone else, or they'll, go to a different path. So I think it's really important to appreciate someone's mental health and mental capacity. I think it's really important we check in with it frequently, because it changes. Just because someone's doing really well one day won't mean that the next week is the same. And so if we can scale our recommendations to be more around nutrition resilience, being able to make the best action, the strongest action, the fastest action in that moment of time of their capacity or what's available to them, that's a much better way of practicing, rather than aiming for that linear progress no matter what. So yeah, I think we have such a strong place as dietitians in mental health, but I think our abilities within that area need a whole lot of upskilling. But I really love that question, because it's such a powerful space, and permission to ourselves to give information or give recommendations that aren't perfect, right? Can feel really icky at times. But I think as a profession, we can all get better at normalizing that for sure. All right. It has ticked over 1:30, so I'm just going to open up to any more questions before we finish up. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We'll send out an email after this session just to go through a little bit more around what we've talked through today, some more information about the Academy. Dan told me just before, he's like, oh, and everyone's going to get an email about getting some free membership to the Academy for a bit as well to trial. So I'm so glad you told me before we jumped on the session. But yes, apparently an email is coming through to you, which is super exciting. So yeah, let us know your thoughts. We really are looking forward to doing this a little bit more often, and your involvement, it means so much to us. It's something we're so passionate to talk about, and really looking forward to where this builds. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I hope you've loved it, and oh, that is such lovely feedback. Thank you so much. That means a lot. So thank you, guys. Have a really great afternoon and a wonderful weekend. Bye.
Thanks, Alicia.
Thanks, team. Bye. I don't actually know how to finish the live on. Let's see. And now, there we go. Bye, everyone.